So crazy. Every single day there's some kind of new development, and basically it's an intensification of what is a genocide. So, for instance, we've seen that this report was released by Francesca Albanese, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, and she detailed how U.S. companies have been profiting from the illegal occupation of Palestinian territory and the genocide in Gaza. And in response to that, the U.S. government put sanctions on this UN human rights expert, which is, just such a blatant violation of every international law, every international norm. And at the same time as this is happening, there are reports now that Israel has this plan to create concentration camps. And you would think that they would kind of distance themselves from the term concentration. But if you read the reports in the Israeli media, they use the term concentration. That's the term they use to refer to their strategy of concentrating Palestinians in Gaza into these small little enclaves, also known, again, as concentration camps. And then according to these reports in the Israeli media, Israel will kill all Palestinians who are not in the concentration camps. This is just a textbook genocide, everything about it. And the response of the US government is to sanction the people opposing this genocide, to wage war on the people opposing this genocide, and then to give more weapons and support to the people carrying out the genocide. So, of course, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just took a trip to Washington. He met with Donald Trump at the White House while this is all happening. And Netanyahu, in order to fly to the US, he went over the airspace of several European countries, which are parties to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And there's an ongoing arrest warrant, an outstanding arrest warrant for Netanyahu over crimes against humanity that he has committed in Gaza. So we see that the West has shown its true face. They don't care about international law. They don't care about human rights. They're carrying out a genocide. All these European countries are also supporting this. And meanwhile, the response of the US is to sanction UN human rights experts and to wage war on Yemen, which is one of the only countries on earth that is actually taking action to try to stop this genocide. Of course, Iran was the other major country supporting the Palestinians and opposing this genocide. And we saw that in June, the US and Israel waged a war on Iran, and it's not over. Now it's called the 12-day war. I don't think it's over. If you talk to anyone in Iran, they all say they're expecting the war to continue. Let's not forget that in January, Trump negotiated a so-called ceasefire, in scare quotes, in Gaza. And in reality, it was not a ceasefire. It was a 2-month pause in which the U.S. rearmed and resupplied Israel so it could continue the genocide, which it did in March. So it was a 2-month pause. And when Israel continued the genocide in March, Trump gave it a green light to do so. So I think it's very likely that the war on Iran will continue at some point. Maybe it's not going to be in a week or a month. It could be in a year, but this is not the end. This is maybe the end of the beginning, but it's certainly not the end. And again, the response of the US government is to wage war on every country that's trying to stop this genocide. So Iran and also Yemen. So when you read the Western media reports about these attacks carried out by Yemen against Israel-linked vessels, they say that it's because this group Ansar Allah, the so-called Houthis in Yemen, are crazy. They never explain the justification, the explicitly stated reason for these attacks. The Yemeni government, the de facto government in the majority of Yemen, in the north of Yemen, led by Ansar Allah, has made it clear that they will stop these attacks when the genocide in Gaza stops. This is humanitarian intervention. This is the responsibility to protect, which the US government has invoked many times to justify intervention in Libya and Syria and many countries. Well, now Yemen is doing humanitarian intervention, try to stop a genocide. And every time they intervene, the US bombs Yemen, threatens Yemen. So once again, we see, we're talking about a completely lawless regime in the US and the West more generally. And everything they do is in blatant violation of international law. And yet they talk about democracy and human rights. It's a complete farce.
There is this active, absolute massacre, genocide happening in Gaza. Yet you have people in that region not giving up. You have Yemen, I said, sinking not one, the Magic Seas vessel, then the Eternity Sea vessel. Both of them were sunk with Eternity Sea. There were actual casualties. An incredible showing to literally blockade the Red Sea still. And then, of course, you have even in Gaza, you have some of the biggest hits that the Israeli military has faced. And all of these have happened right after the so-called cessation of hostilities that occurred in what's called the Israel-Iran War, the 12-day war. While the war and the genocide is endless, there also is not a kind of bowing. And I think Iran showed this. I think Yemen is showing this. I think even in Palestine, where the situation is the worst, that is being shown too.
Yeah, well, the capacity of the Yemeni military is pretty limited. Now, when you read the Western media, they talk about the so-called Houthis, which are officially known as Ansar Allah, as this small non-state armed group. But there was a revolution in Yemen in September of 2014. It's called the 21st of September Revolution, led by this group Ansar Allah, that overthrew a dictatorship propped up by the US, a Western puppet dictatorship. And they had a revolution, and many other political forces joined Ansar Allah. It's not just the so-called Houthis that govern the northern part of Yemen. They created a kind of coalition government with other different political forces, and parts of the Yemeni military joined them. So they have a military. It's not just a small non-state group. However, that said, the Yemeni military is not very advanced. It doesn't have the most advanced technology. It doesn't have hypersonic missiles. Iran does have a pretty advanced military. It's not at the same level as, Russia and China, which are, some of the most advanced militaries in the world. But the Iranian military is certainly more advanced than any other military that has been fighting against Israel. Israel is used to bullying on small unarmed or non-state armed groups and unarmed civilians in Palestine and Gaza. Israel is used to massacring children and women in Gaza, and maybe fighting against the El-Qassam brigades, which is a small non-state armed group, and they're a guerrilla group. Or maybe, Hezbollah, which is a very advanced guerrilla group, but they're not the Lebanese state to the extent that there even is a Lebanese state. The Lebanese army is also pretty weak. Iran, of all of these different forces, definitely has the most advanced military, and it has hypersonic missiles. And Iran showed that it can hit Israel. It repeatedly hit Israel. It went past Israel's air defense systems, which have multiple layers. We hear about Iron Dome. And now there's this big, scam in the U.S., this marketing scheme by Lockheed Martin and other corporations in the military-industrial complex to sell the idea of the Golden Dome, which is just, like I said, a marketing scam. It's not real. There is no Golden Dome. The U.S. has a Golden Dome. It's called the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. I mean, who is going to it's absurd. It's so ridiculous. Who's going to wage war on the U.S.? Canada? I mean, Trump's threatening to annex Canada. It's absurd. So there's this marketing scheme of the Golden Dome that Trump is now going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in, that's going to go to military contractors, potentially even Elon Musk's companies. At least it was going to go to SpaceX, but of course Trump and Musk had a falling out. We'll see. Anyway, the point is that we hear a lot about the Iron Dome in Israel, but there are also other layers of air defense systems, including David Sling and all of this. And Iran got past all of it. All of this equipment that we've heard so much propaganda about from U.S. weapons corporations saying they have the best, most advanced technology, Iran was able to get past it. And by the way, for most of the counterattacks carried out by Iran in self-defense against Israel, it was not using its most advanced missiles. So because Iran knew that this war could potentially escalate further, it didn't want to use all of its hypersonics and most advanced missiles and other technologies immediately. It wanted to keep a lot of those in reserves and use some of its older missiles, which is what it did. So I think this is another reason why the war was, at least temporarily, the pause was after only 12 days. And the U.S. has been resupplying Israel for preparations to potentially start the war again. Because what we saw is that Yemen and Iran have shown that these wars, when they're carried on for a long period of time, they can be very expensive for the West, the U.S.-backed forces, the U.S. and Israel, because they're spending every single day tens of millions of dollars on not only all the missiles, but all the interceptors. because we hear all this propaganda about, David slaying an Iron Dome and all of this. Well, every time they intercept some of these cheap old Iranian missiles, this costs every day millions of dollars just in all these interceptors that they're using, and they don't have an infinite supply of them. So now, after 12 days, the U.S. has been resupplying Israel, potentially for preparations for another phase of this war. And Iran, for the first time, has showed that Israel is not unpenetrable. When Israel is fighting against a small guerrilla group in Gaza that has very primitive missiles that they make in their homes, like these are not very advanced missiles. Okay, yeah, maybe Israel's air defense systems can shoot down these very primitive missiles. But when they're dealing with an advanced military like Iran was able to bloody Israel's nose. It's not just me saying this. There was actually a video of Trump in which he said, man, Israel was really hit hard. Trump himself admitted that. And if Trump said it, it's because he's getting intelligence from the U.S. intelligence agencies saying that, yes, Israel was hit very hard. Now, Israel claims to be a great democracy, which is obviously absurd. It's an apartheid ethno-state. And I mean, even within the 48 borders, to the extent there are borders, Israel is the only country in the world that doesn't actually have borders. But to the extent that it has borders, quote unquote, it's still not a democracy, obviously. Netanyahu famously said that Arab so-called citizens of Israel are not real citizens because they're not Jewish, they're Arab. So, I mean, it's not a democracy. But all that aside, Israel constantly says that, okay, well, we have free press, unlike the so-called authoritarian regimes around Israel. Actually, Israel is one of the most authoritarian regimes of all. But anyway, all that said, in reality, whenever there's a war like this, any kind of armed conflict, Israel has a military censor that controls all of the information that goes out into the public. And especially when Iran was hitting back in self-defense and hitting Israeli military targets in the Mossad headquarters, which, by the way, many of these military targets of the IDF, the IOF, are located in the heart of Tel Aviv, downtown, under civilian targets. So Israel is objectively using its own people as human shields. But anyway, the point is that the Israeli military censor did not allow the public to get access to a lot of information about the Iranian attacks. And of course, the propaganda narrative was that Iran wasn't doing any damage, that Israel was completely safe. That's absurd. We saw videos on social media, at least at first, in which Iran was hitting Israel hard. And then the Israeli so-called democracy announced that any Israeli who publishes social media video of these attacks can be imprisoned. So that's the so-called free press in great so-called democratic Israel. It's obviously absurd. So the point I'm getting at here is that Iran really did bloody Israel's nose. And yeah, they might go back to restart this war, but now they're much more realistic in their expectations. They thought, this is what happens when you believe your own propaganda. The Israeli regime thought that Iran would just collapse overnight, that it was all a paper tiger. They believed their own propaganda. They drank their Kool-Aid, thinking that the people of Iran would rise up and overthrow the Islamic Republic. Supposedly everyone hates it. No, in reality, the Israeli war of aggression and the U.S. war of aggression on Iran has actually increased support in Iran for the Iranian government, because now the people of Iran see that for many years, the Iranian government has said that the U.S. and Israel want to wage war on Iran, to overthrow the Iranian government, to kill Iranian civilians. That's exactly what they did. And yes, critics of the Iranian government said for many years, oh, it's just propaganda, it's not true. Well, now they see it is true. It's undeniable. And as is often the case when a country is attacked, when a people are attacked in a war of aggression, as Iran was, people rally behind the flag and they support the government. So I really think that although, yes, Israel was able to kill some senior Iranian leadership, Iran has always been preparing for this. Iran immediately replaced the military leadership. And I think Iran is actually in a better position now than it was even before the start of this war. And if and when the U.S. and Israel restart the war, I think Iran is going to be much better prepared.
These two vessels, they're the Western mainstream media, Zionists all over social media. They are calling for the United States, for Donald Trump to get involved. Like, what's going on? Why isn't Donald Trump bombing Yemen? Israel is conducting some limited operations on Yemen, but they want the United States to go back in. And there is absolutely no signal that that is going to happen. Even though the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, it was symbolic, the strike that Iran conducted right before the cessation of hostilities. Well, the Associated Press has confirmed that a $15 million U.S. communications dome at this airbase was destroyed, and they published actually this satellite footage where you can see the massive impact that their strikes made. The United States does not really have an appetite, it seems, to go back into Yemen even. And I think that shows that there are some severe limitations that the U.S. has.
Yeah, again, we saw a lot of propaganda about this, and the Western media said, oh, Iran hit this U.S. military base. It's not significant. It's not significant. No one died. I mean, this was deeply symbolic, very, very symbolic. People say, what is Al Udeid, this base in Qatar? It's the largest U.S. military base in the region in West Asia, and it's the forward operating headquarters of CENTCOM, the U.S. Military Central Command, which oversees all of these wars of aggression the U.S. wages in West Asia against Iraq, Syria, also against Libya as well, and North Africa. So this is very symbolic, and the fact that Iran was destroying this important equipment. Now, yes, it is true that Iran did give a notice so the U.S. could evacuate soldiers to not kill U.S. soldiers because they didn't want to escalate the war further, because Iran doesn't want to wage war. Iran was acting in self-defense, and Iran has always shown significant patience and restraint. It's the U.S. and Israel that are the aggressors that are always starting these wars, and their propaganda apparatus and the Western so-called free press, which is not free, and it's not even a real media. Its job is not to inform people. It's to manufacture consent for wars of aggression. And they always tell us that supposedly Iran is this evil regime. But in reality, we see that Iran is the one opposing genocide. Iran is the one trying to de-escalate, pushing for diplomacy. And it's the U.S. and Israel that are supporting genocide, colonizing territories, stealing land, ethnically cleansing people, and carrying out wars of aggression. And I should point out that when Iran was attacked in June, it had been engaging in diplomacy with the U.S. Iran had engaged in several rounds of peace talks with the U.S., with the Trump administration, because back in Trump's first term, he unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. He tore it up and reimposed sanctions on Iran in violation of international law, a blatant violation of a UN Security Council resolution that the U.S. had supported back under the Obama administration. And that was in the first term. Biden came in, and he was, of course, he claimed that supposedly he would undo Trump's policies. He was a complete hypocrite and a liar. And Biden continued all of Trump's policies, especially in West Asia. He did not broker a new agreement with Iran. And then Trump came in his second term, and he said, yeah, I'm going to broker a new Iran nuclear deal. He carried out 5 rounds of talks, and he was using that as diplomatic cover as the U.S. and Israel were planning to launch these secret attacks on Iran, allegedly to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. And Trump claimed that supposedly he destroyed the 3 most advanced Iran nuclear sites. And of course, this is also likely propaganda. There's been a lot of real investigative journalism pointing out that Trump exaggerated the impact of these U.S. strikes. And Trump said that the U.S. and Israel have put Iran back years in its potential development of nuclear technology. It's actually probably months or maybe even weeks. Now, previously, Iran was not pursuing nuclear weapons. This had been reaffirmed many times by international experts, including the IAEA, which we now see has been a tool of the U.S. and Israel. The IAEA was used to spy on Iran, to carry out these surprise attacks on Iran by the U.S. and Israel, which is why Iran has withdrawn from the IAEA. And now it's actually likely that Iran will pursue nuclear weapons because it learned a very clear lesson. It engaged in good faith diplomacy. It signed a nuclear deal with the U.S. under Obama. Trump tore it up. It engaged in good faith peace talks, what it thought were good faith peace talks with the second Trump administration. Trump violated those. He waged war on Iran. He bombed Iranian nuclear sites. So the logical conclusion in Iran is, well, the U.S. cannot be trusted. As President Putin of Russia says, the U.S. is agreement incapable. It is incapable of making agreement and holding that agreement. Why would any reasonable, rational country ever sign an agreement with the U.S. when they know that it could be torn up in a year or two? So Iran is probably going to actually pursue nuclear weapons now. It learned the same lesson that North Korea, the DPRK, learned after, in 2002, the George W. Bush administration announced that it was going to wage war on Iraq, Bush famously gave his axis of evil speech. And what were the three countries in the axis of evil? Iraq, Iran, and the DPRK. So the DPRK logically concluded the U.S. is preparing to wage war on Iraq. Iraq does not have nuclear weapons. We should get nuclear weapons because then the U.S. can't wage war on us. The U.S. a year later in 2003 invaded Iraq in a war of aggression, killing 1 million Iraqis, destroying the country. Millions, in addition to the million Iraqis who died, millions more were displaced and turned into refugees. The country has never recovered. So the DPRK got nuclear weapons. The U.S. has never been able to wage war on the DPRK. So the logical conclusion that Iran has come to is it's probably going to actually pursue nuclear weapons after years of propaganda in the West claiming that supposedly it was. Netanyahu has been claiming since the 1990s for 30 years that Iran is mere weeks away from nuclear weapons. Well, here we are 30 years later. That's a lot of weeks, and Iran never got those weapons. But now, after the U.S. and Israel directly bombed Iran and are preparing for more war, it's more likely than ever. And my bet is that yes, Iran will in a few years have nuclear weapons because of this.
You're a student of the so-called Cold War, the war over colonies, the wars for national liberation, the wars, against imperialism. And it seems like in West Asia, we are seeing really what is not only a protracted war of aggression led by the U.S. and Israel, now spanning the entire region, from what's the horrors in Gaza all the way to a regime change operation against Iran, but also the resistance back, which appears to not only not be quitting, but it's very unpredictable how much this will explode in the very near future, given that a lot of people were counting Iran out for so long because they hadn't waged Operation True Promise 3. And then yet at the moment when they needed to, they did. I don't think anyone was betting on Yemen continuing a blockade of the Red Sea. And yet we are still here. I don't think anyone was thinking, well, how could anyone be fighting in the rubble in Gaza? It seems unfathomable given the inhumanity that is being imposed on the Palestinians there. And yet they are enacting major blows that is causing major concerns for both Israel and the United States.
Yeah, again, the U.S. and Israel are so used to fighting against helpless women and children or guerrilla low-level armies that are non-state actors. So when they actually fight against Iran or even Yemen, which again is not just it is a state. It's not a strong state, but it has a military, and they have the capacity to actually fight back. Unlike women and children in Gaza, who are the majority of the victims of Israel's genocide. So this is unprecedented. This is historic. Iran has bloodied Israel's nose. Trump himself admitted it. And it's going to be a sign in the future that when the U.S. and Israel try to attack Iran again, which they will do, this wasn't the first time, it won't be the last time. Let's not forget that in Trump's first term, he assassinated Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, probably the most important person in the Iranian government after the supreme leader and the president. I mean, one of the most powerful people. The U.S. killed him, and Trump also assassinated an Iraqi military commander, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, another major act of war against Iraq. And the U.S. is so used to not having any significant response. Iran has shown that it can respond and will continue to respond. So, I mean, this is a very significant development. One other quick note here, Danny, which is, we were talking about West Asia here, and people say, why isn't Trump escalating further? Well, it's also because the U.S. strategy now for well over 15 years has been the so-called pivot to Asia. It's preparing for war, and we're talking about West Asia, but of course, people say the Middle East. Well, where do they think the Middle East is? What continent is it on? It's in Asia. It's West Asia. When they say pivot to Asia, they mean pivot to war on China in East Asia. And this started, of course, under Obama in his first term when Hillary Clinton was his Secretary of State. And the idea was that the U.S. would move its military forces out of West Asia and focus on war in East Asia on China. That was continued under Trump in his first term. It was continued under Biden, who deployed offensive missile systems to the northern part of the Philippines. The U.S. now is using several military bases in the Philippines. And the Typhoon missile system that the U.S. has deployed to the Philippines, first under Biden, continued now under Trump in his second term, those missile systems can hit most major Chinese cities. They have a range of 2,000 kilometers. This is a major escalation, a major provocation against China. And now we see that the defense secretary under Trump, Pete Hegseth, this far-right Christian extremist who calls himself a crusader, he has crusader tattoos of Deus Vult, and he wrote a book called American Crusade in which he proudly said that the U.S. will overthrow the Chinese government. He published that book in 2020, his Crusades book. He gave an extremely hawkish speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, in which he said, quote, "We are preparing for war," end quote. So the U.S. is preparing for war on China, potentially over Taiwan. And one of the reasons that the Trump administration is trying to focus less on West Asia is because, like Obama, like Trump in his first term, like Biden, they want to prepare for war on China, but they also want to maintain their hegemonic control over West Asia. And they are using Israel as their attack dog, their unsinkable aircraft carrier, to try to destabilize all of the independent governments. They succeeded in Syria. Syria is now led by the former leader of Al-Qaeda, Ahmad al-Shara, who used to be known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani. And this guy was he was the founder and the head of the largest Al-Qaeda affiliate ever, which was Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. They rebranded as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. And then he rebranded, he puts on a Western suit now. And this guy was a former ally of ISIS. He's the unelected so-called president of Syria. The U.S. has recognized him. Trump just lifted sanctions on Syria. And he's on the verge of normalizing relations with Israel. He's giving speeches saying that we support Israel in its war against Iran because we share a mutual enemy. So, I mean, Iran is really the last standing. Iran and Yemen are the last standing states that have been able to resist U.S.-Israeli colonialism in the region, while the U.S. is preparing for war on China. So, I mean, what's going on, unfortunately, like I keep stressing this is not the end. This is the beginning. Maybe it's the end of the beginning, but this is going to escalate further. There will be more war on Iran, and this is all part of an attempt to prepare for war on China, to isolate China. We already see that the U.S. is at war with Russia through Ukraine, which is a U.S.-led NATO war, using Ukraine as a battering ram, fighting to the last Ukrainian. And if you don't believe me, Trump's former national security advisor, Mike Flynn, who was a top U.S. general who oversaw special operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, Michael Flynn did an interview with Stephen Bannon, who was the CEO of Trump's first campaign. He was his chief strategist in his first term. And in this interview with Steve Bannon, Mike Flynn said that he was asked what the war on Iran was about. He said, China, China, China. He said, if we can overthrow the Iranian government and install a pro-Western regime, a puppet regime in Iran, like the Shah was installed by the U.S. after a CIA-orchestrated coup in Iran in 1953, that overthrew Iran's democratic elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and installed the dictator, the Shah. Well, the U.S. wants to do the same. And as Mike Flynn said, if they can do that, they can isolate China, remove a friendly country, a partner of China, and try to isolate China to prepare for this war that Pete Hegseth says very clearly that they're preparing for.